Real quickly before I move on, I just want to make sure everybody understands the logic of what we were just talking about. It's saying, look, 3% of these tests are going to end up saying, oh, it's not significant, okay? And then the question is, so you got 171 different tests. How many false negatives, false not significance do you expect? And the answer is 5. So when you get 4 negative tests, are those the 4 you should really pay attention to instead of the 167 tests that did show something was going on? The answer is no. Those 4 tests are probably, now we're not 100% sure, but they're probably false negative tests because they're well within the threshold of what we were expecting. We were expecting around 5.13 negative tests anyway. I mean, what would be amazing is if you got 40 negative tests. Well, that would be something. That would be showing you that environmental change is not having an effect. But getting just 4, it's like, well, if you only get 4 negatives, then that means you have 167 positives. That's what you should pay attention to. All right, let's down here to writing the conclusion. Now, the conclusion gets written 2 ways. You either get to say, when the null hypothesis is rejected, when you reject H naught, you get to say there is sufficient evidence to support the statement in the alternative hypothesis. Now, the statement in the alternative hypothesis is going to be, how do I put this? You can kind of put it in extra quotes because you're going to write out what it is. And same down here. You're going to write what the alternative hypothesis is in English. So it's not like you're going to say that phrase. You're just going to paraphrase it. Okay. When you do not reject the null hypothesis, you'll say there is not evidence to support the statement in the alternative hypothesis. And you're going to have to talk about what that is. This part right here gets written out. Let me underline it. Gets written out in English. You don't write it out as you see in this little italicized thing here. All right, so it sounds harder than it actually is. So let's look at the jury-rigged example again. Okay, and just to remind you what we had for a null non-alternative hypothesis. Let me bring it down. We had that the p was equal to 0.5, or we have p is less than 0.5. Here we go. Okay, so if you reject the null hypothesis, then you're stating that there's enough evidence. There is sufficient evidence, or you can say enough evidence, to support the claim that the jury was rigged. See what I mean? You don't write the alternative hypothesis. You say what the alternative hypothesis actually was, i.e. that the jury was rigged. Okay? So you say there is sufficient evidence to support the claim that the jury was rigged. Or the proportion of African Americans, you could write it that way. Or that the proportion of African Americans on the jury panel was way too low. Okay? And then down here, if you decide to not reject the null hypothesis, or the judge decides, right, then you would say there is not sufficient evidence to support the claim that the jury was rigged. That's it. They're exactly the same phrase. And this gets to the weirdness of statistician speak. So, first of all, a couple things. One, we never accept anything, right? There is either enough support or not enough support for the alternative hypothesis. That's it. Never anything else. And while we're on the subject, when you make your rejections, let's put it this way, reject or not reject the null, but the conclusion is about evidence supporting the alternative. So you make your decision about the null hypothesis. You say, okay, I reject the null. See that? Reject the null. But then out here, I'm talking about there is enough evidence to support all of this is the alternative. See? And then here, I do not reject the null, right? Again, I'm talking about the null, but down here, when I write it up, I'm talking about the alternative. They kind of flip-flop on each other. So one step you'll reject the null, the next step you'll support the alternative. That's how it works. All right, we're done with that section.